Hello, this is the next in our series of London Moeder Advisors videos, just to talk about the great issues of our time. And as you can see on the screen, this is not Nathan Moeder, my partner, talking to me today, but Norm Miller, our colleague and good friend and professor who has joined me today. And our topic is going to be growth and demographics, population movement in Southern California, in California, and throughout the nation. What the implications of all that are in terms of things that really matter to us, things like housing policy and economic policy and how the markets are going to change. And I think the theme of the day is past is not prologue with respect to people movement and demographic changes in both our local Southern California region and throughout America. So I thought that we'd have a discussion about that. But firstly, I'd like to introduce Norm Miller. Norm, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are?
I'm affiliated with the University of San Diego as an emeritus professor now from the Real Estate Center. My background is finance and economics applied to real estate. And I've been observing, studying, consulting in this industry for over 45 years now.
Oh, you didn't have to give that away. A couple old guys talking to each other, but I think that's probably, I don't know if it means that we are wise, more informed, less informed. I guess we'll find out as we have this discussion. And by the way, I should say that Norm and I talk about these things all the time. We're just just going to share this with the wider world here to give you a sense of some of the things that we're thinking about. So I thought the place I'd like to start, Norman, is with the place that we sit here today. You and I live and work in different parts of San Diego, and San Diego is a region of well over 3 million people. I think we're at about 3.4 million people right now. And like you, I've been in business for a long time, and for much of the last century, San Diego grew by an average of about 30,000 persons per year. This was really over a 20-year period from 1970 to 1990. And following that, the region still grew, but at a much slower pace. Since 1990, the pace basically reduced, very, very significantly. But really what matters is going into this century and going forward, SANDAG, our regional population forecasting agency, among other things, projects that we essentially are going to be stagnant as a region. We're not really going to grow at anything near what we've grown at before. And that has implications in and of itself. And the reasons for that are, all you really have to do is look to what the major factors of growth are. They're births, deaths, migration, both foreign and domestic. And all those factors have changed a lot. But what the factor that's changed the most is out-migration, just people moving out. And mainly that has to do with housing and affordability. And mainly that targets people who are families with children, people that really can't get a start in a very expensive coastal market. And these kinds of phenomena don't just apply to San Diego, do they? They apply to really all of coastal California. As a matter of fact, in bigger ways in other parts of California, don't they?
Absolutely. This is a statewide trend. We have no exception in Southern California. What I find most interesting about the out-migration in San Diego is that it tends to be dominated by the lower skilled, the middle class, less so than the college educated professional groups who are both moving here and leaving here at about the same rate. So we're kind of in equilibrium on the high end, but it's the lower end group that can't afford to live here, and they continue to look elsewhere. And it used to be that those jobs, had to stay here, but they don't have to stay here anymore to the extent they did.
So we're going to get into that in a few minutes. But on the same theme, I did want to expand it and suggest that, as you have suggested, California itself is going to be pretty stagnant apparently, in terms of growth. And the last few years have been any kind of indication that roughly 40 million or so people we have in California are going to stay roughly 40 million people or thereabouts in the coming years as all these factors of growth sort of come together to create, some demographic and population stagnation. And these things have major implications in terms of our economy. And what's interesting to me is that in the state itself, and this applies to Southern California, to LA, to Orange County, to San Diego, the people that tend to stay are those that are in the most affluent portions of our population, the richest and the oldest. And the people that tend to be migrating out are people who really need to find, or feel they need to find opportunities elsewhere. The other phenomenon that's occurring, and this is occurring, if you sort of take a broader picture now, not just in California, but all over America, there's a trend to the suburbs or to even rural areas. And a lot of that is what you have insinuated a few minutes ago. It has to do with the fact that people and their businesses are substantially more footloose than they have been historically. We're not tied to a commute, or we're not tied to a factory or to an office in the way that we have been tied to all those things in the past, which means that we can sort of live everywhere, anywhere. And that has huge implications, doesn't it?
Location-free jobs, yeah. And we had an acceleration of that during COVID, and some of that has stuck. Some of it was a long-term trend anyway. I mean, as an example, customer service centers and call centers that operated for the airlines or customer service for tech companies. You remember just 10 years ago, they used to rent these big giant call centers. And then they realized that they could set up technology where people could work from home. They could take a break, they could take care of the elderly, they could retain workers they couldn't retain when they forced them to commute to a call center. And so it was, a great blessing for these companies that they could keep and retain people and tell them you can work at home. So we have more location-free workers than ever. And as you said, that has huge implications about who's moving where.
So in this kind of a situation, there are winners and there are losers. And we can talk about winners being suburban and rural areas, and losers being the more urban parts of our cities. And it's not just coastal California. It's not just West coastal Los Angeles or West coastal San Diego or Orange County or San Francisco. It's also places like Chicago. I mean, people moving out of sort of the center parts of Chicagoland and going into the suburbs. It's happening in New York City. People moving from New York City out of the city into the northern and western suburbs. And it's happening in Florida, people moving out of Miami and into the suburban areas. It's happening all over the country. There's that sort of intra-urban, intra-regional movement.
So there's 2 points related to what you're bringing out. One is that when you only have to go to work 2 days or 3 days a week, or sometimes not at all, you can live in satellite cities and further away, maybe an hour away commute, take the train in, that you wouldn't have considered if you were going in every day. So people have spread out. Our bid rent curves, which used to be very dense, have spread out. Transportation cost is lower when you don't need to go in as often. The other point is that the first tier cities, the expensive cities, have tended to be the losers. Chicago, San Francisco, LA, New York. The second tier cities and third tier cities have been the beneficiaries. Even some pretty good sized cities, Las Vegas, Austin, Phoenix, have been beneficiaries of this movement away from the really expensive cities. So the lower commuting costs, the spreading out, and then the first tier cities losing to the benefit of second tier cities. So that's definitely a clear pattern that looks like it will be permanent. not just temporary.
Very sticky. And as you suggested earlier, I see this as, obviously it was, a lot of these phenomena were pandemic related, but this has been occurring for a long time. In fact, the way I sort of pithily put it is, it went from evolution to revolution. In other words, what the pandemic brought about was it allowed companies and people to sort of throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks. And what has stuck is this sort of suburban rural movement, this work at home movement, this flex job movement, and it has resulted in what you have articulated.
If you look at the office footprints, they have been declining in size, the average footprint of the average business for the last 2 decades. As you point out, these are longer term trends because people were sharing space more and working anywhere, not just at home, but airports, hotels, everywhere, Starbucks. And the same with the retailers. They were already shrinking. So these were longer term trends, but then COVID came along and took what might have taken 10 years and squeezed it into 2 years, just accelerated. It took the diehard stubborn types that said, hey, I'm going to do it this way. We've always done it this way, and shaking them up a little bit. And they had to jump on the bandwagon of how can we keep going when we can't get together. So it's remarkable how resilient the businesses came out of it afterwards, but definitely an accelerated trend. And as you said, it's sticky. It's going to be with us long term.
We'll get to the implications of that in a moment, but I wanted to broaden the discussion because another phenomenon has been occurring as well. And it's the fact that most of the movement in America in our lifetimes, yours and my lifetime, has been to what we call the so-called Sun Belt, which is principally California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. And some of the smaller movement in the states in between are contiguous. That movement hasn't changed at all and isn't forecasted in the short term to change, except for this intra-regional movement from the big cities, like from Houston to the suburbs, Dallas to the suburbs, Miami to the suburbs, and Los Angeles to its Riverside and San Bernardino suburbs and so forth. But the actual just bigger geographical movement hasn't changed. But my sense is that it will, and that a lot of people aren't talking about it or don't have their arms around it. And the reason for that change will be climate change. And here's my thesis, and see if you agree or disagree with me about this. And again, I have found that I tend to be mostly correct about these things, but I'm usually wrong about the timing of it. So I may be talking about something that will be decades in the making, but let me sort of throw it out anyway. It seems to me that if you look at a map of the United States and the parts of the US that are most affected by climate change, that in essence are painted brown versus green, are the very same states that we have labeled the Sun Belt states. And at some point, and you've seen it all summer, at some point these places become so sort of uninhabitable or too expensive to inhabit in terms of air conditioning, that sort of thing, that one would think that there's going to be movement out of these areas at some point to northern climates, that the big winners might be places like Illinois and Michigan and Chicago, the old Rust Belt. In other words, the movement really was, it went from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. So the question is, are people over time going to move back north again? Is there hope for other parts of America going forward because of climate change?
I agree with part of your thesis to the extent it's related to flood risk, hurricane risk, tornadoes, weather, but less so when it comes to heat. I've been watching Dubai, Abu Dhabi, places that I consider too hot to live in, and yet they're still growing.
People live there. But they do it under a roof, right?
And they're still considered very livable cities because they have tunnels between shopping centers and office buildings and garages. So they've adapted, and I guess the lesson there is we will probably adapt to the heat. On the other hand, the flood risk, I don't see people moving out. They're still moving to Florida and Texas, by the way, despite all those risks.
Yeah.
And Florida's going to be half underwater by the end of the century for sure. I mean, the trends are just so clear. But either people that are moving there are old enough that they don't care because it's not going to happen in their lifetime, or the insurance costs are not high enough, and FEMA and the government is willing to subsidize people enough every time there's a big disaster and put more sand and more rocks and take care of them, that they don't pay the real cost of the risk that they're taking on by living in places like Key West.
Yeah.
So the trigger for me in your prediction will be when the insurance costs triple. I know they probably doubled already, but when they triple from where they are now, and they're closer to where they should be, and you can't get the insurance unless you pay outrageous rates, then we're going to see a real migration because people are going to say, hey, this is too costly, and they're going to move more inland, and Florida will move more upstate, or people will move to other states. That'll be the trigger, and I think that will happen within 5 years, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you. I think insurance costs are definitely going to be the catalyst or the driver to a lot of these changes of movement. And then the other thing is just how many times can FEMA and the federal government really step up to the Mauis and the Floridas, and even what we just had. We had big storm in Southern California, or we have earthquakes here. I mean, at some point, all of these things, many of which are related to climate change, the scientists tell us anyway, are going to add up, and it's got to result in some government nudged movement of people, if not companies themselves, will moving and driving growth or change, and then just people not being able to afford the places that are the most dangerous to live in.
And do you as a taxpayer want to subsidize somebody who's rebuilt 3 times?
Right.
Like Jimmy Johnson lives down there in the Keys, and his home is messed up, and he says, oh, by gosh, I'm going to rebuild. And there's people that have rebuilt 3 times.
Yeah. I want to come back to that in a minute, but I don't want to forget about another topic that I think ties into this, which is immigration. I mean, obviously, the U.S. has not been able to effectively respond to the immigration along our southern border. And you sort of can pick your poison on this one, but the way I like to sort of frame the immigration issue is that we are a land of immigrants. So we've always had immigration. Usually it came across the Atlantic Ocean, but it came. And now much of our immigration historically has come from Central and South America. And the question there is not so much how do we stop people at the border, but why are they coming in the first place? And do we really need them to be here? So let me just touch on these and let you expand on it. My attitude about immigration is that the source of it really, again, is climate change. It's the fact that people are coming from places, particularly in some of these Central American countries, that have lost their economic reason to exist. Agricultural business is bad. It portends bad leadership, crime, corruption, all these things that are driving people north against all odds. They're making huge sacrifices to get to the U.S. So the problem is that the problem isn't that people are knocking on our door at the border and coming in. That's just sort of the play out of the problem. And the other thought I'd put out, and then I'll let you sort of go from there, Norm, is that these people that come into this country are actually needed in this country. That's my sort of philosophy that has guided me in thinking about this, that we need workers. I mean, our unemployment levels are very low. Domestic Americans are not filling a lot of jobs that need to be filled, and they can't be filled by AI or technology at as rapid a rate as they're needed. And our immigration policy is starting with particularly the Trump administration, and actually continuing into the Biden administration, have frozen people from coming into this country legally or illegally, and that's affected low-skilled jobs. It's also affected high-skilled jobs, and I think these are things that impact us economically.
Yeah, you're right. Let's start with the positive side of it. You made the point that we need these people. We need two types of immigrant workers where we don't have enough. One is to do the low-skilled jobs that Americans don't want to do, like picking crops and putting roof shingles on and cleaning hotel rooms. We don't have enough workers that are willing to do those jobs. So we need some kind of a system to allow that to happen, and temporary work permits would be one. We also need high-skilled tech workers because we don't have enough engineers, we don't have enough programmers. So if you look at the policies of Singapore and Canada, they seem to be the smartest countries in the world in terms of immigration policies, where if you have skills that the country needs, come on in, and they encourage it. We, on the other hand, seem to have a very perverse incentive system, where if you manage to get in here, you can have food stamps, Section 8, rental subsidies, all kinds of things. If you can get through the gauntlet of our backlog system, which doesn't give any priority as it should to the skills that we need, give some priorities to relatives if you happen to be lucky, or some lottery system. So we definitely have a broken system on the gauntlet to get quickly in the people that we need. And I don't see any actions to fix it right now, but it will continue to be a problem. Countries that you mentioned that are losing population, like Brazil, Russia, they seem to not enforce property rights. They seem to be criminal states with such an extent of corruption that people feel unprotected and want to flee, justifiably so. That's going to continue as well for most of South America. And so this is not a problem that's going to go away, but I sure wish we could have a faster, quicker screening process and bring in the people that we really need, because we definitely do to help the economy continue to serve the rest of America that doesn't want those jobs or can't fill them.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate that that regions grow partly because of migration, and one of the reasons we're seeing stagnation, particularly in California and in Southern California, is because our immigration numbers are down, both foreign and domestic immigration, and what we call in-migration if it's domestic. People aren't coming in domestically at the levels that they used to. The California dream is not the same, and people aren't able to come into California from other nations, regardless of the nation they're coming from, whether they're coming through Mexico, from Central or Southern or South America or other places. They're not able to get here because of this gauntlet of bad public policy or disingenuous public policy, as you mentioned, and that's a big factor there. So we don't have that in terms of driving our growth numbers. We don't. We have domestic outmigration in Southern California, and we don't have immigration. And you put all that together, and it creates problems. And the other aspect of that is that families locally really can't afford to stay here unless they're propped up by their parents. We did a stat check just for home sales last month, and we discovered that 1 out of 3 homes that were sold, now, mind you, home sales are down. because interest rates are up and people are sitting on their homes that have low interest rates, not willing to move. And we're not building a lot of new homes. Those are all factors. Those are all another discussion. But the point is, 1 out of 3 homes right now are being sold at all cash, and those that aren't, over 30% of the sales are high down payment. 30%, 40, 50% down payment, which means help from mom and dad, and that sort of thing.
So it's about 3 times normal all cash. I mean, we always have some all cash movement, especially in the senior citizen population, but it's about 3 times normal right now, which makes sense given where interest rates
It makes sense. It makes sense, but it's unprecedented. We really haven't seen it at this level before.
So nobody's really moving because of affordability. They're moving because a death in the family, or there's nobody there anymore. A job,
or they can. In other words, we go back to the theme that people can move where they want to move and not necessarily be retired. They can work and they can go to they can basically work and vacation at the same time in other places.
Well, let's say you get a job in Arizona or Nevada, and you're sitting on a 2.75% mortgage. If you're smart, you're not going to sell your home. You're going to keep it, rent it out, move to Arizona, wait until interest rates come down, and then you'll sell it. So that home selling volume will explode if we get back to something under 4 or 5% again.
And we probably will. We're in that waiting period right now, is what you're saying.
Yeah, what I'm saying is the only people that are moving now are because of death, essential reasons, divorce, job moves that require them, to move where they can't hold on to the old home for some reason. But it's non-financial drivers. Yeah. Otherwise, you're not selling.
It's interesting because San Diego, in particular, has seen pretty sound economic growth over recent years because we've benefited from the high cost of living in Silicon Valley and in the San Francisco Bay Area in particular, and to a lesser extent in Los Angeles. These companies moving down here, expanding down here, Apple and a lot of the other high technology or life science companies have moved here because they perceive San Diego as expensive as it is. And the average price of a house right now is what? $850,000. That's a median price. That's expensive from our point of view, but if you're up in the Bay Area, that price is 2 or 3 times in terms of average or median.
We're still cheaper than New York, Honolulu, San Francisco, and a few others. So we're not LA, you're right. They can move down. And keep in mind too, you and I are so spoiled. The richest people in the world that can live anywhere that are location free are always going to desire places like San Diego. We're always going to have a market of people that live here simply because they can, and they bring their wealth with them. And it doesn't really matter whether they have a job or not. And San Diego is always going to have relatively high prices simply because of that appeal.
So that's a good segue into the last sort of theme I wanted to discuss, and then we'll get into some policy implications of all this. I think that San Diego is, and I'm going to expand that and say Western Orange County and Western Los Angeles as well, maybe even up to Santa Barbara. I think we're in the climate change Goldilocks zone. And I think what you just described is the play out of that. And we're going to see a lot more of that going forward. In other words, what I'm saying is this: when you talk about the things that matter with respect to climate change, hot weather, sea rise, bad weather like tornadoes and hurricanes, and other stuff. Basically, coastal Southern California, we have our earthquakes occasionally, but we're way less susceptible to all those other things. And I think that plays out over time into people who have become, as we've discussed, increasingly more footloose, whether they be in the national market or the international market, usually affluent people, desiring to be in coastal California because they're not burdened by all these sort of climate change phenomena. Am I smoking something, or do you agree with that?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at Florida, it's basically flat, and you could be in the middle of Florida and be 15 feet above sea level. Here, there are places that are relatively flat, affected by climate change, sea level rise. Imperial Beach, parts of Del Mar, parts of Pacific Beach. But you go inland a half a mile and you go up the hills, and there's topography here. So compared to places like Florida, you're right. We are immune from some of the really dramatic long-term flood risk issues. We'll still have them here, but they'll be more manageable. And meanwhile, we'll still have that ocean's debilitating turning of the earth that brings the air in from the west, that keeps our climate great. So we're in relatively good shape for the next half century, at least.
That's good enough for me.
Me too.
So let me sort of end this discussion by going to what I'm going to call policy implications of all this, be it public or private. And my frame of reference is a book that I read many years ago called The American Dilemma. And it was actually a book about the history of Detroit. And it started out by talking about the economic reasons for growth of that particular major city. All cities grow for a reason. And in that case, it was, the lumber industry, which ultimately morphed into the auto industry, which created a great city and lots of economic growth for lots of the 20th century. And then it went dead and dormant and created stagnation, population growth stagnation, lots of issues that are associated with all that. And then in contrast, you've got places like, Phoenix and Los Angeles, and certainly San Diego, where we've enjoyed huge economic growth, hand in hand with population growth, lots of prosperity. And so now we're seeing, as we started out our discussion, sort of a new reality, where we're seeing relative stagnation. We're not seeing growth. We're in sort of a magical moment right now, the last few years, because we're benefiting, as we've just discussed, from places that are more expensive, people coming here, businesses coming here, lots of growth. But at some point, that story ends. And so where do we go in the future if we make the presumption that a healthy city, a good city, is a city that's always sort of rejuvenating itself with economic growth? Are we really going to have those experiences going forward? And what kind of things should we be looking at from a policy perspective as a result of all of that?
Wow,
that's a big ask. I know
that's a drum I've been beating for a long time. As you know, we have a lot of things going for us in San Diego. We have the defense-related industries, which give us tremendous stability and are able to survive COVID or anything else. We also have the blue economy industries, because you can't really move those.
Which is in its embryonic stages and will grow.
Yes, and will grow. And then we have a fair amount of life science that we're lucky that we have, and that's been great for the area. And we have some tech. So it would be great if we would continue to promote those and not promote tourism, which hires restaurant workers and hotel workers that can't afford the housing here. And so I'm hoping that we promote industries like an Illumina versus and other life science versus just expand the convention center without regard to can the people that work there afford to live here. So that's what I'm hoping for, that we continue to build on our strengths and the things that are working well.
Well, I'm hoping for that as well. And we're going to do we'll do either another video or a succession of videos on how to address that, because we're maladdressing a lot of those issues right now. You've insinuated the fact that we seem to emphasize the tourist business, but forget that the people that that work in those businesses tend to be the lowest paid workers, and the ones that in particular can't afford the lifestyle in San Diego, particularly housing. So That's an issue that we have to address, and we're really not handling affordable housing in an effective way. The current public policy is again, it's a subject for another discussion, but it's not really up to the burden that we're creating. The people that work in places like Illumina or the Qualcomms or the Apples and so forth, the companies that have grown here or are moving here, those are the people that can afford the lifestyle. So we're changing there as well.
But on the big picture and avoiding housing affordability for now, there's two things that really matter longer term. One is city and state government matter, and whether you have good government or bad government. And cities that you mentioned, like Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, have had pretty bad city management, and they're paying for it. And it means less immigration in the future than otherwise. The only reason they get any immigration because they're so cheap. The second big factor is education. And even though you said the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt is growing, there are exceptions to that. Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, they're not growing. They're actually stagnating. They're going to stagnate for a long time because they provide absolutely too few skills in their education system. So nobody wants to hire people from there because the public education system is just too inadequate for a modern society. So one of the things that we've done well historically is education, and I'm hoping that we can keep our good education systems going, public improve them, and universities retain them, and that will keep us in good shape. You know, if we can keep improving the schools, at least not let them deteriorate, not follow the path of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, where they just spend so little per student that they're going to stagnate. So our city management could be better, but it could be worse.
Yeah, I think that I sort of look at the cup half full. I think a lot of our policymakers are exceptionally good people. I think the problem there is always they have tendency to look in the short term, not the long term, because they get reelected in the short term.
That's right.
That impacts negatively good public policy with respect to housing, for instance, and some of the economic direction that they should be pushing us to. And I agree with you. I think that education is clearly a huge component that we need to reemphasize. As a father with children still in school, it's something that I think about a lot. I know you do.
And to hit that point a little bit harder, California has subsidized Texas tremendously. We educated with our better public schools kids that moved down to Texas.
Yeah. Well, at least without an accent, right? So I think that's just to put a cap on all of this. I think that as I said at the front end of our discussion, it really is a discussion about past is not prologue. That the things that we've thought about in the past and the solutions that we've come to in the past aren't really going to be defensible solutions going forward. We need to sort of think about what the implications of this more stagnant population growth are, and what the demographic movement is, and what the economic play out of this is in a very, very different way. And it affects the real estate sector, developers, investors, and so forth in a very profound way. So you can't just look at the model of the past. You mentioned this in terms of office. You know, when we're looking at the methodology of employment, of new employment buildings, the metric that we used to use with respect to office occupancy was 250 square feet per employee. Well, the metric that was 20 years ago, the metric 30 years ago, the metric that we're using today is more like 150 to 175 square feet per employee. And that has to do with, technologies and efficiencies and disintermediation,
and sharing,
of administrative people, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And these have huge implications in terms of what we build and what we invest in terms of the commercial markets. And we can see these changes play out in all the sectors of our economy. And these are the things that we need to be thinking about.
But those are exciting problems. And create a lot of demand for consultants and educated real estate professionals. So
So in that regard,
problems are opportunities.
yeah, and so that means that we get to do this and have fun for the next 40 years, right?
That's right.
Nobody ever retires. All right, Professor Miller, Norm, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thanks.